The operating theater smelled of sterilized metals and something sharper, the acidic tang of expectation. Dr. Vrox's frilled crest twitched in amusement as the med team wheeled in the stretcher, the so-called specimen, barely breathing. Beneath a thin biogel sheet, this was humanity. The legendary terror of the outer reaches. The race whispered about in the black market alleys and rogue war councils. Pathetic. Vrox made a point of circling the human slowly, letting the assembled interns and junior doctors take in the spectacle. The creature was hideous by coalition standards. A lopsided skull, uneven bipedal frame, exposed dermis bruised and leaking from multiple orifices, primitive, inefficient, and utterly vulnerable. "Observe," Vrox announced, voice amplified slightly by the chamber's comms. He gestured grandly toward the unconscious figure. "An example of biological hubris. A carbon-based organism whose survival depends entirely on redundant failures. 2 lungs to breathe yet inefficient. A heart that pumps liquid vulnerable to any simple toxin. Digestive acid barely strong enough to dissolve organic waste." The students tittered, recording notes into their slates. Vrox grinned internally. He loved these demonstrations. There was no better way to showcase the superiority of coalition genetic engineering than by examining relics of natural evolution. And humans, it seemed, were the final exhibit in a very outdated museum. "Proceed with the baseline scans," he instructed casually. A junior assistant and species unknown but with trembling hands activated the diagnostic bed. A hum filled the air as particle threads mapped the human's internals. Vrox expected the usual: catastrophic organ failure, minimal neural activity, unsalvageable tissue. Instead, the console blinked. An error. Frowning, Vrox tapped the screen, manually. Another error. No coherent data. Murmurs rippled across the room. He rerouted the feed to the overhead projection, magnifying the human's internal readings for all to see. And there it was. Not failure. Adaptation. Capillaries, instead of rupturing, had formed temporary bypasses. Torn muscles were cross-linking fibers without external aid. Neural pathways showed rerouted traffic, as if the brain itself was actively triaging damage. Heart rate fluctuations were strategic, slowing only when needed to minimize blood loss. Vrox's smile faded into a flat line. "This is inaccurate," he muttered, waving at a technician. "Recalibrate the array." The technician obeyed swiftly. New scans appeared, even more unsettling than the first. The human's blood, far from clotting in disorder, was laying down fibrin structures enhanced for flexibility. The immune system wasn't just reacting to injuries, it was improvising. Building temporary pseudo-organs where needed. Somewhere behind him, a student whispered, barely audible, "Sir, is it evolving?" Vrox turned sharply. "No organism evolves this rapidly. It's a glitch, equipment failure." But the words felt hollow even as he said them. The human twitched under the biogel sheet. Not a death spasm. A deliberate movement. Controlled. One eyelid fluttered open, revealing a bloodshot but aware eye. A gaze so sharp, so heavy with raw survival instinct that even Vrox involuntarily stepped back. The creature's lips cracked open, dry and broken. A rasp escaped. Still breathing. The monitors exploded into a symphony of impossible readings. Blood pressure normalizing, neural plasticity surging, mitochondrial output quadrupling. It wasn't just healing. It was rebuilding. Vrox felt his gut twist, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his first year in trauma simulation. Fear. Real, instinctual fear. Around him, the student's amusement drained away, replaced by something colder. Unease. The door to the chamber hissed open as Chief Administrator Kellick stormed inside, furious. "What is this disturbance?" Kellick barked, eyes scanning the chaos. Vrox turned stiffly. "We underestimated the specimen, sir." Kellick narrowed his gaze at the human, now visibly stirring, slowly rising on broken limbs that should not have supported any weight. "You said they were primitive, Doctor." Vrox swallowed hard. "They are," he whispered, barely convincing himself anymore. But there's something else too. The human, bleeding, battered, and impossibly alive, locked, eyes with the alien official staring down at him. A smile cracked across his ruined face, not of gratitude, of defiance, of promise. And for the first time in centuries within the sterile walls of the galaxy's finest medical institution, a single, terrible truth took root. Humanity was never meant to be understood. It was meant to be survived. The alarms had stopped screaming, but the silence that replaced them was worse. It pressed down on the medical theater like a physical weight, thick and suffocating. Every monitor, every scanner, every hovering drone had gone offline the moment the human moved, not by sabotage, by proximity. Dr. Vrock stood rigid, his eyes locked on the impossible figure before him, a broken, bleeding human who by all logic should be dead, but instead was standing, breathing, adapting. It was Administrator Kellex who spoke first, voice low and disbelieving. "Restrain it." The order triggered a ripple of action. 2 containment guards surged forward, wielding neural suppressors tuned for Class 5 entities. Overkill, perhaps. But Vrox found he couldn't summon the arrogance to object. The human watched them approach with an eerie calm. Then, without warning, he moved. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't even violent. It was efficient. One guard stumbled mid-step, legs crumpling as if invisible wires had been cut. The second froze, screaming, as his suppressor short-circuited and exploded in his hands. Neither had been touched. Vrox's analytical mind, still desperate for logic, caught the detail. The human had shifted his stance, altering the electromagnetic field around the failing equipment. Instinctively, intuitively. Adaptation. Beyond conscious thought, the human staggered slightly, gripping the surgical rail for balance. Despite the victory, his body was still visibly shattered, but his systems were compensating faster than degradation. Vrox forced himself to move, barking at the assistants. Divert power from non-critical sectors, boost atmospheric suppression, fields. Now, the theater's lights dimmed as auxiliary systems rerouted energy into the atmospheric stabilizers, creating denser gravity pockets designed to pin down even apex predators. The human shuddered under the pressure. Bones cracked. Blood seeped anew from reopened wounds, but he didn't fall. He adjusted. He bent slightly at the knees, shifting his center of gravity, redistributing strain along his battered musculature with microsecond precision. The room watched, frozen, as the human relearned how to move under new physics. Kellex turned to Vrox, eyes wide with thinly veiled panic. "What is it?" Vrox answered truthfully, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know." The technicians scrambled to reestablish a diagnostic feed. Minutes passed. Finally, the main display flickered back to life. Patchy, but functional. Everyone turned to the data. What they saw shattered every known biological law. The humans, mitochondria, once classified as primitive powerhouses, were undergoing rapid fission, replicating new energy nodes throughout the cellular structure. Nervous tissue, once severed, was fusing under electromagnetic guidance. The immune system was coordinating, orchestrating an internal reconstruction with a tactical intelligence no alien bioform had ever demonstrated. And most disturbing of all, the genome itself was shifting, not mutating chaotically like a virus, strategically rewriting itself in response to trauma, optimizing in real time. Evolution at weaponized speed. "This is impossible," one of the senior researchers croaked. "No species can alter its own DNA outside of generational cycles." "He's doing it," Vrox said flatly, interrupting. "And he's winning." They zoomed in further. Within the human's bloodstream, microstructures had begun to appear, primitive organic analogs of synthetic nanites, constructing latticeworks of internal scaffolding where bones had shattered. Vrox's hand tightened around the edge of the console. "They don't need augmentation," he whispered, realization dawning in a chilling cascade. "They are augmentation." A tremor ran through the observation platform. The human had dropped to one knee, finally overwhelmed. But not by failure. By choice. He was conserving energy, strategically pausing to optimize recovery rates. Even exhaustion was weaponized. Across the theater, the first cracks of true fear began to show among the staff. These were the best doctors, the greatest biological minds of dozens of worlds, and they were watching nature itself being outstripped by a creature too stubborn to die. Vrox thought back to the centuries of coalition arrogance, the quiet assumption that evolution had been conquered, that biological systems were static and predictable. The human shattered that illusion with every agonized, deliberate breath. The room was silent again. No alarms, no shouting. Just the steady, unstoppable pulse of something old, primal, and terrifying. Humanity wasn't advanced in the way the coalition measured advancement. They weren't polished or perfect. They were built for one thing: to survive what should kill them. And right now, under the cold, analytical gaze of the galaxy's finest minds, that survival was rewriting biology itself. Vrox turned toward Kellex, finding no mockery left in him, only a grim certainty. "We need to contain this," he said, "before it's too late." But somewhere deep inside, gnawing and undeniable, another thought bloomed. It already is. The human knelt motionless under the crushing atmosphere field. But the battlefield wasn't his body anymore. It was his DNA. Dr. Vrox watched in grim fascination as the updated scans unfolded across the central display. Not errors, not anomalies. Blueprints of a biological uprising. At the genomic level, the human was rewriting himself. Spurred by trauma, triggered by mortal threat, the ancient blueprint buried deep within human cells had ignited an evolution, cascade so ruthless, so precise, it defied every known law of bioengineering. The data came faster than the analysts could interpret. Gene clusters once considered dormant were flaring to life, activating sequences never before observed. Adaptive blood polymerization, neural redundancy layering, skeletal reinforcement without external catalysts. Vrox's mind raced. This wasn't evolution in the traditional sense. It was battlefield optimization. Centuries ago, humanity had been forged in brutal crucibles. Ice ages, plagues, endless wars of attrition. And somewhere deep in their genetic code, the species had decided survival wouldn't happen over millions of years. It would happen now. Kellex leaned closer to the monitors, his exoskeletal joints clicking nervously. "Is it contagious?" he asked, voice low. Vrox shook his head slowly. "No, it's not viral. It's personal. It's self-contained warfare." The human shifted slightly, his breathing evening out into slow, measured gulps. Not desperate gasps for life, but controlled respirations designed to maximize oxygen exchange under pressure. Every instinct Vrox had, every training module, every clinical experience, screamed at him that the human should be dead. 5 times over, instead he was adapting, strategically, intelligently. "What do we do?" a junior medic whispered. Nobody answered. Because deep down, everyone in that chamber was beginning to understand. There was nothing to do. Nature had already lost. Technology had been outpaced. Only survival remained, and humanity had evolved to weaponize even that. A low, resonant tone began emanating from the human, not a vocalization, but a harmonic generated by micromuscular adjustments across his chest cavity. Vrox blinked, recalibrating the scanners. It wasn't noise. It was signal, patterns, bursts. A kind of biological sonar mapping the room, calculating mass, distance, energy signatures, all while appearing motionless. The human was gathering tactical data, planning his next move. Vrox gripped the edge of the console until his fingers ached. If a single wounded, isolated human could do this, what would a battalion look like? A colony? A world? He shuddered. Across the room, Chief Kellex finally moved, his orders sharp and desperate. "Sedate it. Now." Maximum dosage. The medics hesitated, but duty overrode fear. 3 moved forward, wielding injectors laced with sedatives strong enough to drop a Korak warbeast. The human did not resist. He allowed the needles to pierce his skin. He allowed the chemicals to flood his bloodstream. And then, he adapted. Molecular binders designed to inhibit neural signals were broken down and rerouted. Sedatives designed to suppress muscular response were metabolized into energy substrates. The drugs didn't slow him, they fed him. Vrock stumbled backward, horror creeping into his bones. The human rose to his feet, slowly, steadily, bearing the weight of the enhanced gravity as though it were a mild inconvenience. Blood still wept from torn flesh. Bones still jutted at wrong angles, but the will behind the body was relentless. Unyielding, unstoppable. A siren shrieked, not from the human ear, but from the containment system. Structural failure detected, atmospheric suppressors degrading, gravity fields collapsing. The room lurched. The human looked up, locking eyes with Vrock's across the chaos. No hatred, no anger, just inevitability. As if to say, "You were warned." Vrock felt something primal and cold settle in his chest. This wasn't a specimen. This wasn't even a soldier. This was survival made manifest, and it had no master. The chamber doors slammed open as armed security poured in, weapons primed. The human didn't flinch. Instead, he turned his head slightly, analyzing the newcomers with clinical precision. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was calculating. A chill ran through Vrock's mind as he realized the horrifying truth. Humans weren't the apex predators because they were the strongest, or the fastest, or the smartest. They were apex because they were relentless. Because when the universe said, "You cannot survive," humanity replied, "Watch us." The first stun blast arced toward him. The human moved, not with elegance, but with brutal, efficient adaptation, exploiting every gap, every hesitation, every flaw in coalition design. Systems collapsed, weapons misfired, containment fields shattered, and in the chaos, humanity proved once again what it had always been. Not a mistake. Not a miracle. A warning. The restraints hummed against the human skin, tightening automatically with every twitch. Not that he struggled. He simply sat there, perfectly still, as if already planning 1,000 moves ahead. Dr. Vrock watched from behind reinforced glass, heart hammering against his ribs. For the first time in decades, the Coalition's most advanced biocontainment suite had been activated. A sterile cage of gravitational fields, electromagnetic dampeners, and neural suppressors layered in relentless redundancy. The human, bleeding and broken, should have been helpless. Should have been. Instead, he observed his surroundings with a terrifying stillness. Calculating. Mapping. Waiting. Vrock turned away, trying to steady himself. Around him, the senior researchers whispered in frantic clusters, throwing out wild theories, biological anomalies, covert augmentation, evolutionary miracles. But none of them dared approach the real truth. They weren't studying the human anymore. The human was studying them. Administrator Kellick slammed his hand against the conference table. "I want full dissection authorization," he barked. "If we can replicate even a fraction of that regenerative capability." Vrock cut him off, voice sharper than he intended. "You won't get cooperation," he said. "You'll get extinction." The room went silent. Kellick's mandibles twitched, but he said nothing. Because deep down, even he knew, dissecting this creature wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. Still, orders were orders. Vrock returned to the observation deck, watching as automated probes snaked toward the human's immobilized form. Scanners passed over his body, collecting terabytes of data every second. Every organ, every tissue, every cell, all documented, categorized, analyzed. But something was wrong. The readings were changing. At first, small anomalies, cellular densities fluctuating outside expected patterns, neural synapse pathways rerouting without any external trigger, and then larger shifts. Within minutes, entire data sets contradicted earlier scans. Biological constants refused to stay constant. Tissue models invalidated themselves in real time. Vrox leaned closer, realization dawning like a rising tide. He's not just adapting his body, he's adapting to our analysis. The human had figured out the diagnostic methods and was manipulating his internal systems to create noise, false positives, dead ends. He's fighting us with information. The probes retracted abruptly, confused by the gibberish data. Kellex cursed under his breath. "We'll open him up manually," he growled. "Scalpels never lie." Vrox hesitated, not from loyalty to the coalition, but from a cold, logical understanding of what would come next. He studied the human's face through the glass, battered, bloodied, smeared with dried gore but smiling faintly, knowingly. The scalpels deployed, hovering over the human's limbs. Precision lasers aligned for incision. The observers leaned forward. The first blade descended. It never touched. In an instant, the restraints shattered like brittle glass. No visible force. No kinetic surge. Just raw, brute inevitability, as if the human's very presence rewrote the rules of containment. The chair crumpled. The force fields blinked out. The human stood, every movement slow, deliberate, inevitable. One of the researchers hit the emergency lockdown panel, but the doors refused to respond. The lights flickered, the gravity shifted. Reality itself seemed to strain under the human's silent defiance. Inside the chamber, the human tilted his head slightly, studying the horrified faces behind the glass. Not raging, not roaring, just existing. And it was enough to paralyze the room. Vrox whispered the only truth that mattered now. We taught him everything he needed to escape. They hadn't captured a specimen. They had educated an apex predator. Every scan, every probe, every data point, lessons. Lessons on coalition systems, lessons on alien physiology, lessons on control. And now, the human had all he needed. Administrator Kellex slammed his hand against the control console again, desperately trying to reboot containment. It was futile. The human had adapted to more than physical threats. He had adapted to their entire technological ecosystem. Outside the broken cage, the human moved forward, slow, unstoppable, and the walls shuddered as if recoiling. Kellex bellowed for security reinforcements. Dozens of guards stormed the corridor, weapons drawn, suppression fields flaring. The human paused, assessed, and smiled wider. This was no longer about survival. This was about message, a demonstration. To every species that had ever laughed at humanity's primitive biology, to every scholar who had ever dismissed them as evolutionary footnotes, to every empire that believed flesh was weaker than machine, the human lifted his shattered arm, flexed broken fingers, and adapted, new bone knit. Tissues hardened into something not quite organic, not quite machine, not better, different, stronger. The first wave of guards opened fire, energy bolts slicing through the air. The human moved, a blur of brute force and brutal efficiency, exploiting physics, inertia, timing. Every strike precise, every counter a calculated break. Within seconds, the corridor was silent again, filled only with unconscious bodies and the heavy thud of retreating boots. The human turned back to the observation glass. Vrox stood frozen, breath shallow. The human's voice, when it finally came, was raw and low, but every word hammered into Vrox's bones. You learn. You evolve. You survive. The human pressed a blood-stained palm against the glass. And then, you teach. The glass, rated to withstand planetary quakes, cracked under his touch. Vrox stumbled. Back as alarms howled anew. But it was too late. The lesson had already begun. The facility should have been impenetrable. It had been designed to contain bioengineered warlords, rogue AIs, even collapsing singularities. But none of those threats had prepared them for a wounded human who refused to lose. Somewhere deep in the ventilation shafts, the human moved without sound. No alarms, no frantic gunfire, only the steady, inevitable rewiring of control. Dr. Vrox, stood in the emergency command center, eyes glued to the flickering monitors. Each camera feed told the same story: sectors going dark, power grids rerouted, security doors cycling without commands. The human wasn't escaping anymore. He was taking the facility apart, piece by piece. Administrator Kellex slammed his claws against the console. Find him, end him. But it was too late for shouting. The human had shifted the battlefield. No longer brute force. No longer survival instinct. Now, it was strategy. Entire squads of guards disappeared between checkpoints. Weapon lockers were found sealed shut, access codes overwritten. Vital corridors collapsed with precisely timed structural failures. Trapping response teams. Not one trace of the human's presence. No footprints, no plasma burns, no residual biometrics. He had become the perfect countermeasure, built from the very oppression meant to contain him. Vrox leaned heavily against the console. We didn't capture a prisoner, he said quietly. We created an apex. The others ignored him, barking orders, launching drone swarms, all too slow, too loud, too predictable. Meanwhile, somewhere in the shadows, the human adapted faster than their systems could react. It was a slaughter of certainty, a quiet, devastating reordering of power. In the facility's lower levels, the human crouched silently over a disabled relay hub. His movements were fluid now, no longer hindered by shattered bones or torn flesh. His body had mapped the injuries, rerouted strength around them, compensated with terrifying efficiency. He studied the exposed wiring, fingers brushing lightly across alien metals. In seconds, he understood more than most engineers ever would. Pressure points, control nodes, emergency redundancies. He rerouted life support from the command center to the cryo prisons, forcing the leadership into environmental lockdowns, scrambling their oxygen supplies. He looped security cameras into endless feedback loops, making his presence an unsolvable puzzle. He wasn't just escaping anymore. He was erasing their control. Silently. Perfectly. Back in command, Kellex gasped as oxygen warnings flashed red across the room. The walls were frosting over. Breath crystallized midair. The human's face appeared briefly on a broken monitor. A grim, battered visage, blood drying in sharp lines down his face. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The message was written across every system failure, every flickering light. Your power was an illusion. Your control was borrowed time. Vrox felt a shudder run down his spine. This was no rebellion. This was evolution fulfilling itself in cold, unstoppable logic. He saw it now, the horrifying genius of it. The human hadn't just adapted to survive. He had adapted to dominate sector. By sector, the facility went dark. When coalition reinforcements finally arrived hours later, they found only silence. No alarms. No guards. Only empty halls filled with frozen terminals and shattered illusions. The human was gone, leaving nothing but questions and warnings behind. And in the heart of the wreckage, on a cracked command terminal, scrawled in alien and human, script alike, one final message remained. We watched, we learned. Now it's your turn. Vrox read the words over and over, a growing pit opening in his chest. The galaxy had mocked humanity for its crude biology. But now, staring into the ruins of the Coalition's pride, he understood. It wasn't humanity's weakness they should have feared. It was their ability to turn chains into weapons. By the time the broadcasts reached the core worlds, it was already too late. Footage leaked in fragments, shaky, distorted feeds of collapsed facilities, silent corridors littered with shattered weapons, and a single human silhouette walking calmly through the devastation. No roaring speeches, no grand declarations, just silent, inevitable proof. Control was an illusion. On every diplomatic channel, leaders demanded answers. Was it sabotage? A bioweapon? Gone rogue? A coalition failure? The truth, when it finally emerged, was worse than any conspiracy. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't a weapon. It was evolution, and it wore a human face. In the great hall of the Galactic Council, Ambassador Vrox stood before the assembly, a trembling shadow of the once proud surgeon who had scoffed at human biology. The council's thousands of eyes, orbs, and photoreceptors bore down on him, demanding an explanation. Vrox swallowed hard, then activated the central holo display. It showed the human, not in chains, not under suppression fields, but walking free. Calm, alive. Subject 44B, Vrox began, voice hoarse, entered our care with massive internal trauma. By all known biological standards, he should have expired within minutes. He hesitated, the weight of history pressing on him. But instead, we witnessed an unprecedented biological phenomenon. Adaptive survival triggered by acute trauma, real-time genomic restructuring, tissue optimization, tactical cognition. He paused, letting the words hang heavy. In short, we did not imprison a broken organism. We provoked a self-evolving apex entity. A ripple of fear spread across the hall. Whispers, frantic translations. Vrox pressed on. He adapted faster than any known species, faster than any theoretical model predicted, faster than our strongest containment protocols. The hologram flickered, showing the cracked command console where the human's final message had been left. Vrox read it aloud, voice barely steady. We watched. We learned. Now it's your turn. The council fell into a stunned silence. There were no answers to give, no solutions to offer, because deep down, every species, every empire, every so-called superior mind in that hall understood the same dreadful truth. If one wounded human could dismantle the coalition's pride, what would happen when humanity arrived prepared? The ripple became a wave. Worlds withdrew from the coalition overnight, fearing contamination. All human settlements were reclassified from observation to high-threat quarantine zones. Recruitment centers froze intake for expeditions toward Sol, the Terran system, and in the shadows of the galaxy, mercenary fleets rewrote their contracts. Engagement. With humans prohibited without triple-scale hazard pay, colonial traders deleted Earth from their star charts entirely. Better to pretend it didn't exist. Better to hope humanity stayed confined to their little blue cradle and never remembered the mockery, the arrogance, the casual disdain heaped on them for centuries. But hope was a fragile thing, and humanity had long since learned what happened when hope broke. They adapted, and they survived. And now they were watching. Vrox stood alone on a barren observation deck days later, watching Sol's star twinkle faintly on a forbidden sector map. He thought about the human, bloodied, broken, and yet unstoppable, walking calmly through the ruins of the coalition's arrogance. He thought about the genetic data still locked in encrypted vaults, too dangerous to study, too terrifying to ignore. And he realized the final, irreversible lesson. They hadn't simply underestimated humanity's strength. They had underestimated humanity's will. The will to endure. The will to learn. The will to become something no empire, no council, no god could control. And above all, the will to remember. Because humans didn't need superweapons. They didn't need fleets or galactic councils. They needed only a reason. And, now, the galaxy had given them one. Vrox closed his eyes, a single thought searing itself into his mind. A prophecy the council would deny until the moment it consumed them. When humanity returns, it won't be in chains. It will be in judgment, and, this time, no walls would hold them, no laws would bind them, no one would laugh.